how, first of all, how did you even get to this topic to begin with? And the book was released back in 2012, but it's probably more, if not as relevant as it was today when it was back in 2012.
Yeah, we were hoping it would be obsolete by now, but unfortunately it's not. So I got into this because I'm a computer scientist. And of course, since the early 2000s, we've really moved to computers for running our elections. And unfortunately, as we've come to learn, these computers were not necessarily properly used. It's not that I am opposed to using computers in elections, but they have to be used properly. And by, for example, starting off with paperless voting machines, which is what we did in the early 2000s, that was just a grossly inappropriate use of computers. Computer scientists all know that what you see on the screen is not necessarily what gets stored inside the memory of the computer. And therefore, you just can't trust what you see. You've got to have some other evidence. And in that respect, the evidence we need are paper ballots. It's paper ballots.
Just to give me a quick example of the output not being correct, on these voting machines specifically.
One of the issues with paperless machines is that it's impossible to determine whether or not the output is correct. So one of the frustrating experiences we had when by we I mean a number of computer scientists started fighting against these paperless machines is that people would say, well, show us a case where they were wrong, or show us a case where they were hacked. And you can't. That's the whole problem. And so the same thing holds, for example, with internet voting. You can't determine whether or not the results are correct. Now, there is an example, and I'd have to go back and get the specific details of this, but there is an example with the Republican primaries, it turns out, in a relatively small town where paper ballots were used, and the ballots were tabulated by scanners. And those scanners were not properly programmed for this particular election. So in this case, they had ballot rotation, and that wasn't put into when the scanners were programmed, that wasn't put in correctly. So when the results were initially announced, this young kid who nobody expected to win was the big winner, and the person who was expected to win wasn't. And people talked to each other and said, hey, we voted for this other guy. And it was a small enough election, people knew each other, that they were finally able, and this took a bit of a fight, to get the paper ballots manually recounted. This was, I think, in New York. And again, I'd have to go back and check. So I'm going to be asked this on at the actual session. I'm going to have these details right. Where it turned out that candidate A was given the votes for candidate B, B was given the votes for C, and so on. And the announced results were, in fact, incorrect. But once they did the manual count, they discovered that the candidates who were expected to win actually did win.
Right.
But this wouldn't have been possible on a paperless machine, and it also probably wouldn't have been possible in a very large race where it would be difficult to make a strong case that these results are incorrect. Now, there are two takeaways from that example. One is that we need paper ballots, but two is we also need good laws that make it possible, in fact, make it mandatory to check the paper ballots against the computers that count them. And as I say, in this case, they had to go to court to get this recount done.
Right. So, you're not against, electronic voting per se. You just say, hey, we just need basically bounds and the ability to do checks on those, voting machines, right? It seems like we're heading towards electronic voting no matter what, right, eventually.
Well, it depends on what you mean by electronic voting. I mean, one of the problems is that these terms aren't well defined. So I consider it electronic when we have hand-marked paper ballots tabulated by scanners, because scanners are electronic. And in fact, they're computers, which again, I think a lot of people don't realize that scanners are computers, and therefore they can be hacked, therefore they can have software bugs. They have they have the same problems that any computer has. So I consider that electronic voting, but you're not voting on a computer per se, it's just the computer that's tabulating the votes. So in some cases, people are using computers to cast their votes, which I think is bad if you're basically counting on the computer to store the information. There are new voting systems out that use computers to produce paper ballots. Some of these are controversial. They're called ballot marking devices, and I can get into that a little bit later if you want. I think that there is at least one good ballot marking system out there, but it's not widely available at the moment. And then there are hand-marked paper ballots. But even with the ballot marking devices and the hand-marked paper ballots, the ballots are tabulated by scanners that are computers. So all of these things use computers at some point. And then, of course, we have internet voting, which is obviously computers. And then we have the latest buzzword in internet voting, which is blockchain voting, which I hope we can discuss because it's a terrible idea.
Absolutely, and thanks for clarifying. And you're absolutely correct. The definition of what electronic means. There are, microchips almost in everything, as you mentioned, whether it's the scanners or obviously the computers, the devices, even the, routers and switches that, are being used to collect and transfer that data. Everything is electronic, has some microchips in it. So anytime there's a computer or microchip involved in that process, that's considered electronic voting per se, despite the fact that people maybe not be aware because they basically filled out the forms manually. When we're talking about electronic voting, most people have in their minds that it's essentially you go into the internet and you type in, you kind of cast your vote online, but people don't realize that even when they go out and they vote using pen and paper or pencil paper, it is still electronic voting, just due to the process associated with that casting the vote.
Right.
And so that's really fascinating, and I think that's going to be something that's not totally people are aware of.
And that's why we need risk limiting audits. Have you heard about them?
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, so we've been running elections sort of like in the 19th, it was still the 19th century. No legitimate business would be run the way we run our elections in this country. We do not check the results afterwards in any kind of reasonable way. In most cases, there are some exceptions. And what we really need to do is we need to have paper ballots that are marked by the voter. We need to have strong chain of custody of those paper ballots, which is really critical. And then we need to have post-election audits that check that the scanners that we both agree are computers that count those votes are behaving correctly, that they haven't been hacked, they don't have software bugs, and so on. And we finally know how to do that. In 1965, California had passed a law that required a 1% manual recount for all elections. So randomly selecting a precinct and doing a total manual recount so at least 1% of the ballots have been recounted, which was a very advanced law for its time, but which is not really relevant today. It didn't say, for example, what to do if you find a problem. It didn't even define what a problem is. It had no way of escalating the count. So Philip Stark, who at the time was chair of the Department of Statistics at UC Berkeley, was the first statistician to look at this problem, and he came up with a statistically based method for doing audits, which involved, randomly selecting ballots and checking them against the scanners. And he called that risk limiting audits. Colorado did risk limiting audits for their elections in 2017 and 18, and they'll do them again in 2020. Rhode Island passed a law to do them, but most states don't do them. So most states either have some kind of audit that is a percentage based, like 1% or 3% or 5% of the ballots, sometimes tiered, so that if the race is closer, they look at more. And then some states do nothing at all. And some states even have laws that make it really hard to do post-election ballot audits. Mm-hmm. And it should be like looking at the books of a well-run business. You should be able to go back and verify that the results are correct. And we don't do that, by and large.